Thank you. Vice Chairman Fairfield, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the Senate Government Oversight and Reform Committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about Senate Bill 295. This very brief piece of legislation would simply repeal House Bill 194, an elections law reform bill passed by the General Assembly and signed by the Governor last year. Let me be clear, although my bill will repeal House Bill 194, I supported and voted for this legislation. I believe that in order for the will of the people to have a true impact on society, it is vital that all public elections are conducted with genuine integrity. A small group of opponents, however, has decided that some of the reforms contained in 194 are not to their liking, and they've initiated a process to place the legislation on the ballot. House Bill 194 was meant to be in effect for this year's elections, but due to the referendum effort, the guidelines will not be in place in November. Therefore, I believe that the time has come to hit the reset button. We should take a step back and reassess the situation. Clearly, some of the issues should be revisited. Since late last year, a group of senators have been working on these issues and the objections contained to the provisions contained in House Bill 194, seeking a compromise. They found that the vast majority of this legislation is non-controversial and would receive bipartisan support. A functional framework for reform agreed upon 2 years ago between Republicans and Democrats could serve us well as a backdrop to moving forward. I hope as we restart this process, all members and interested parties can come together to find the right set of reforms for Ohio. Vice Chairman Faber, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, I would like to thank you for your time and consideration, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions from the committee? Senator Steen.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Chair Coley, from your testimony, talking about the reset and looking at the language, is it the intent then after this legislation is adopted, 295, then at some point in time there will be new legislation brought forward?
Absolutely, and our goal is, and I've talked to Ranking Member Smith privately about this, our goal is to use the structure that had been agreed to by both parties a couple of years ago as a framework, and then everybody to come in and put forth ideas, and let's see if we can reach an agreed process in which we can move forward for this year's elections to make them better for everybody involved.
Thank you, Chairman Coley. I do not know what that structure that was agreed to by both parties a couple of years ago. Could you delineate that for me?
I wasn't in the Senate at the time, and I know a number of members have been involved in that. I know Senator Seitz was involved. At the time, Secretary of State Bruner was involved, and a number of other people were involved. My colleague Senator Ophoff has been carrying the ball on that hugely, trying to reach a compromise on that. And so, you know, we were hoping that by working together and reaching across the aisle, we can build support, bipartisan support for a provision that will be in place and in effect for this election and address a lot of concerns.
Thank you, and to Chairman Coley, do you, is the repeal of 194 at this point in time, could that be unconstitutional?
I don't believe there's any way it could be unconstitutional. I mean, look, you know, a lot of people on the Democrat side of the aisle did not like that bill. And as I said in my testimony, I don't think they disliked everything in the bill, but there were a provision here, a provision there, that caused them to vote no on the bill. I don't presume to get into anybody's head on the exact reason they cast a vote one way or another, but my impression from talking to others is that there were one or two provisions here and there that were objectionable. And I think the better way to go forward is to sit down with basically a clean sheet of paper and say, hey, look, here's what we had talked to before. Are we still in agreement on these principles? And then see if there's any other principles that we can reach bipartisan agreement on and then move forward in that fashion. But, you know, right now, the goal here is to just step back and, you know, some have filed referendums and some have said, hey, look, we want to step back from that. And since the provisions of that bill would not be in effect this November, I think the best thing to do is say, okay, fine, we're going to give you what you want. We're going to step back from that. Let's repeal that, and let's see if we can move forward together in a bipartisan fashion.
Follow-up? Other questions? Senator Smith.
Thank you. Chairman Coley, we've talked on several occasions about different things, and this being one of them. One of the things I failed to ask you is, why now? If this happened, instead of when we had a chance to do it before we now?
Senator Smith, thank you for the question. You know, I think right now, I'm not saying, I wasn't on the committee and I wasn't handling it back then, but I think really the concern right now is that I think both parties, and I think the electorate as a whole, have a real concern as to how things are going to proceed this November. And I think everybody wants to make sure that their elections are fair, that every vote is counted, and that every individual's the institution of voting is protected for all. And with those provisions and with those kind of principles in place, I think that's a bipartisan issue. And to the extent that the provisions of 194 wouldn't be in effect anyhow, which means we're still operating under the old election laws, which everybody had objections to one way or another, I think it's just best to let's see if it's not going to be in place anyhow. Let's see what we can do to reach across the aisle. And if it wasn't done before, I wasn't here then, and I apologize to the extent I was involved in anything that wasn't. But I think the important thing is looking forward from here. Let's just stop. Let's hit the reset button. Let's pull this back, and let's see if we can work together in a bipartisan fashion for something that'll help Ohio this November.
Senator Smith.
Mr. Chairman, say for instance we all agreed to, on this committee, to pass this out. Do you think that your side of the aisle would agree to do a moratorium on any kind of election reform after the 2012 election if we were to agree to pass this? Just for instance, maybe.
I mean, it's an interesting hypothetical. I don't think anybody, I'm not aware of anybody, from my discussions on people on both sides of the aisle, that was 100% happy with the election law that was in place for the last election. I think everybody had suggestions that make things better. And to agree to a moratorium to not try and improve things would seem to be contrary to, our oaths of office to try to make things better for everybody. So, to the extent that we can put something in place that could, especially if we can do it in a bipartisan fashion, I don't think either side would want to not make things better and make the process a little more equitable and a little more fair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But I did hear you say, Chairman Coley, that you were committing to work across the aisle to the extent the other side wants to participate in the process, that you would be willing and open to work with them hand in glove.
Absolutely, and as I expressed to Senator Smith privately, all ideas are on the table, and we're going to talk about everything. There's going to be a fair vetting of everyone's ideas, and what we're going to look for is ideas that have bipartisan support and overwhelming support. And while it's impossible to always obtain unanimous support, I think to the extent we could work for that, things that we're all in agreement on, I think that's a lofty goal that we should try to ascertain or try to achieve as much as possible.
Thank you. Other questions? Senator Otto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Coley, first of all, I want to thank you for bringing this to our attention. I agree it's important that we do hit the reset button on this issue. And I guess this isn't really a question for you, maybe as perhaps as somewhat of an answer to some of the things that we've heard before. But I think if we look at the overall thrust of 194, there's a lot of basic good government things in there that nobody really disagrees about, that aren't controversial. And some things, frankly, that if we could get into place sooner rather than later, I don't think anybody would really have a problem with that. For example, 194 provides for bulk purchasing of election supplies. It modernizes bid thresholds for ballots and for election supplies. It increases polling place accessibility by requiring compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. It specifies that journalists have access to polling places. It allows for data sharing between elections officials and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. It improves access to voter registration by creating a secure system for online registration. Are any of these things that you think need to wait until after November, if we were going to try to reenact something?
No, absolutely not, and I can't imagine any member of the General Assembly in opposition to those items. Senator, your question points out the very thing that I was trying to get to. There are certain items that will receive near unanimous consent, and some items that we might decide to put in the bill that will receive huge, overwhelming support, but maybe not unanimous consent. Rolling back to, I understand the political aspects of what we're talking about. I mean, I know not members of the General Assembly, but the politicos out there might say, hey, this is going to benefit our side if this stays on the ballot, and that'll help get people to the polls, and we're going to win the bid. I get that. I mean, I understand that. That's not the goal of this legislation. Just think back a year ago. There were certain bills, I seem to recall watching a debate on Fox News, where I watched, the Democrat member and the Republican member, discussing issues of then Senate Bill 5. And, would we really have had huge opposition had we hit the reset button there and said, well, hey, we all agree on these things. If we agree to repeal the bill and go forward on these things, would everybody have said, no, that's wrong, we want to go to the ballot on this? I don't think so. And to the extent that you learn from the past and you look going forward and you say, hey, look, what can we do to try to build consensus on the way to go forward? I think it's a good thing. And a number of the items you just pointed to, Senator, and I commend you on all your hard work in this area, a number of those items you just talked to, I think we want to get in place for this election. And that's the purpose of this bill today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Coley, actually, a number of those things I specifically highlighted because they were things that some members of the other party have mentioned as things that they'd like to see. And I thought it was important that we understand that there is a lot of room for agreement here. And I think you're exactly right. If we can hit the reset button, if we can avoid a costly and divisive referendum when it's not necessary, and when the vast majority of things that we're talking about are areas of agreement, then it seems to me that that's the right thing to do.
Exactly, and if somebody has a problem with what everybody does, then they can proceed accordingly. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to try to come up with a bill that there's a great consensus that it's a good thing. All the items you just mentioned, a few more, those are important things, and getting those things in place. If you're a handicapped voter, or you're a voter with physical impairment, it makes it difficult for you to go to the polls. Those provisions on Americans with Disabilities Act are very important. They shouldn't have to wait until the next election. Let's get those things in place. Let's look at other things like that and get it in place for this year. And I'm sure, in fairness to the people who put this on a referendum, I'm sure it was not their intention to stop those things. They had other provisions in the bill that they didn't like, and that's why they put it on a referendum, even though it's having a detrimental effect to people with disabilities and other items that are affected, as you pointed out. So I just think it's imperative right now we hit the reset button, as we say. We pass this legislation, and we move forward from there and try to build consensus on the right way to go forward.
Other questions? Senator?